You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. If you want to go over and hear the audio stream and find all the different locations where you can find this show and others from Odyssey over on the radio or anywhere else on the internet. There's all sorts of outlets where you can pick this show up. And you can, of course, come and watch the video simulcast of this broadcast over on my YouTube channel. And that YouTube is Scotty Roberts or Mr. Scotty Roberts. Either one works. And so welcome to the show today. It's Friday. It's the end of the week. And as I usually say, it doesn't always feel like the end of the week for me. As I work here at home, my office is always here. The beauty is I enjoy what I do for a living. So while I may have to work a bit over the weekend on some big projects for some clients, you know what? It's still Friday. And my kids went off to school today, grumbling and mumbling that it was Friday. And we'll just see how the whole rest of the day progresses. And folks, I want to talk today on this whole, we've been kind of talking about the paranormal the last few days, and I want to hit something that somebody brought up in the chat room, I believe it was yesterday, and something I haven't talked a lot about, and that is the Jinn. The Jinn, D-J-I-N-N, is the way you would spell it in English, the Jinn. And of course, this is where we get our word genie from in the kind of watered-down English version. And I wanted to talk about what the Jinn are. And from all sources that I have heard over the years, the Jinn are something you don't want to mess with. They're like, I guess you would call them like natural spirits that dwell on the earth, and interaction with them can be good or bad depending on, I suppose, the mood of the particular Jinn with whom you have interacted. And my understanding also is that they are beings that you don't want to mess with. And so we're going to look into that a little bit today, find out who the Jinn are. And I've even got, if we get to it with time, with all the information, as usual, I've got all these different windows open and different bits of notes and things I've taken to talk about the Jinn. If we get to it, a man who claims to have had a conversation with a Jinn, and he transcribed it. So it'll be interesting to go through that as well. I'll try to make sure we have time for that, mostly in the second segment. And so I want to talk about the Jinn. Those of you out there listening to this show, listening to what I'm saying now, many of you have been involved in the supernatural or the paranormal to one extent or another. You've either been paranormal investigators like I have done for years. You've been interested in the paranormal. You've been curious about it. You've had your own experiences where you've seen ghosts or encountered spirits of one form or another. Maybe even the demonic, which is something I've never really, other than probably brushing up against it, never really been too involved with and never really want to be involved with. That's something that I don't like. I don't like to get myself too tangled up in that sort of thing. And so, and by the way, demonic issues, you've got everything from oppression to possession and all those different things. And so the big questions that we have to ask in all of this are something I talked about yesterday, is how much of this is real and how much of it is psychology. How much of it is, and maybe there is a fine line there as well, between what is psychological, what is mental or emotional issues with an individual versus what is spirit obsession or spirit possession. And I know that there are lots of cases out there where they've been deemed eventually to be not much more than then psychological disorders. Not that I'm belittling those by saying not much more than, but they end up being emotional or psychological issues as opposed to actual external spirit beings. And so some of these things have to be looked at with, even today, talking about the Jinn, we have to look at this and ask, are we looking at something that's purely mythological, fairy book tales, or fairy tale stories, or are they real beings that ebb and flow throughout humanity? And so it's an interesting study either way. The idea with the Jinn, or the source points of the Jinn, come from this, that God made angels from light, and he made men from mud and clay. If you think of the book of Genesis, God made man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And then there's the Jinn, who were made from smokeless fire. And the passage is from the Quran that says this, and it talks about a mysterious and ancient race of beings called Jinn. Now, I always wonder about using the word race with this, because I don't know that they can reproduce offspring. What makes a race? A reproducible offspring, or just a caste of beings that have always been in existence? Is that a race? Well, whichever it is, these are a mysterious and ancient set of beings, and they're called the Jinn. And in the Western world, we're familiar with men, angels, fallen angels, often being referred to as demons. And in the Muslim belief, there's no fallen angels, but instead a different third race that is much older than the human race. The Quran makes it very clear that the Jinn existed long before mankind came onto the face of the planet. Just how long before, no one seems to know. Nobody for sure. There's lots of guesses at it. Some Islamic scholars say that they lived on our planet 1,000 years before humans. Some say 1,000 centuries. So, who are they? What are they? Where are they? What do we have to do with the Jinn? So the word Jinn, as I said, D-J-I-N-N, or you can say J-I-N-N, can be traced to the Persian word jana, or janu, which simply means hidden. And this indicates that the Jinn are invisible to humans unless they want to be seen. And according to Islamic belief, the race of Jinn lived in desolate locations. And these places are said to be haunted or cursed, and people kept away from these locations, fearing that they might invite the wrath of a genie, D-J-I-N-N-I, for the spelling there, for invading its privacy. And I want to tell you just a little story here, and I may have made mention of this over the years. When I was in Egypt once, working with my friend John Ward and his wife Maria Nilsson, mostly I would go for pleasure, to go hang out in Egypt for a while, and we went there for a month. The first time I went was in 2013 to go research the book that I wrote with John on the Exodus, and spent a month there. And then I've been back subsequent times where I joined them during their archaeological season over at their dig site, which is really a much bigger than just a dig site. You think very isolated when you think that. But about 20 miles square that spans the two sides of the Nile, the west and the east banks, down about, 60 to 100 miles south of Luxor down the Nile. Up the Nile, really, but it's because of the way the river flows, but south of Luxor. And they would have their dig house on a big boat, an old dahabeah. And this dahabeah, you know what they are. They're like the big old cruise ships. Think of the Victorian era. Well, this boat that we were on was a boat that dated back to the Victorian era. And it had 10, 12 cabins below deck. And it had a big wide open deck on top that they put up staves and canvas roofs and things like that. And that became the offices and the place where we all hung out on the sofas and things like that out on the deck. And So there were a bunch of Egyptian workers that worked for John and Maria at this site. They came hailed from the local villages around, and there was one day on both the banks of the Nile. You pretty much have the eastern deserts to the east, with between the Nile and the Red Sea, and over on the west you start walking, you're in the Sahara Desert, and it's all this rocky, craggy. Think of landscapes you've seen of pictures from Mars. Well, that's what it looks like. So there were shrines all along the west bank, and there's one big one, a speos, which is a temple that's kind of carved out of the rock, and the speos of Horemheb, where we always moored the boat. And up on the hills, one of the afternoons, one of the Egyptian workers came running back to the boat, and he was running from the hills, the rocky crags, and he was yelling that he saw a jinn in the rocks. And he may have, what he felt was disturbed one of these haunted, cursed, or quiet locations that were hidden from people where the jinn dwell. And he came running back to the boat, and all the other Egyptian workers joined him, and they all went down in the hold of the ship and smoked shisha the rest of the day and night, and none of them would set foot on shore the rest of that day or night until the next morning, because of the jinn and the superstition of the jinn. Now, did he actually see one? We don't know for sure, but this is what he claimed, and the rest of the guys, the Egyptians, believed him, and it pretty much shut down work for the day. And John and Maria respected that because that was their belief there. So that's how strong, even yet today, the jinn holds sway over the minds of local people. And of course, you might be thinking, well, this is third world and so on and so forth. Well, these things are still beliefs that are believed today. You question some of the Egyptian archaeologists that worked with John and Maria, and they would attest to believing in the paranormal and believing in the jinn and things like this, these Islamic professors and scholars. So it's a very real thing today. In modern times, or modern terms, the invisibility of the jinn and living in a distant and hidden, desolate place could instead mean that they exist in a parallel dimension that's close to our own reality. They're out of reach, can't be seen in the normal sense, and it makes one wonder if shadow-like beings which are reported around the world are jinn spying on us by pressing against the membranes that divide their world from ours. That thin veil that is there. Sometimes veils that cannot be pierced, sometimes veils that can be seen through and reached through. And so the question naturally gets raised, how close are we to the jinn? Is jinn just a cultural thing that takes place in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, in Muslim and Islamic countries? Or was it just the Muslims and the Islamics that defined these beings that exist everywhere? And this was the definition they put on it. In the Middle East, the jinn race are considered to be very real. Even in the modern Arab world, there are a few who think the jinn are simply legends. In Turkey, the jinn are not only feared, but they're respected. From very early ages, children are taught to stay away from them, never go to a place where their world borders our own. Now, of course, you're not going to find that on a map. That's all local folklore. You go to Ireland, and you go into the back country a bit where the people still speak Gaelic. And even today, and they'll tell you, don't go near the ruins of this castle, or don't cross that bridge on certain nights, or don't go stumble into a fairy ring in the forests, because these are places where those beings dwell, and they cross over into our world. And perhaps this is exactly what's being talked about with the jinn. In the Western world, we have little knowledge of the jinn, but they've been mentioned in media and some literature as genies, and mostly storybooks. Most of us in the United States are familiar with the 1960s television show I Dream of Jeannie. with Barbara Eden and Larry Hagman. Barbara Eden in a genie suit, hubba hubba, I may say. And so in this popular sitcom, which you can still find in syndication today, the thing is over 50 years old, pushing probably 60 years old. Barbara Eden plays this ditzy genie who's released from captivity in a bottle by unwitting astronaut Tony Nelson. That's Larry Hagman. And Genie falls in love with Tony and tries to help him in his life by granting wishes to obtain things that she thinks he may like or need. However, she always tends to kind of screw up his life a little bit and makes poor Tony a lot more complex. And as a result of this show, the animated Disney stories of Aladdin's lamp and other various tales of genies, that we in the Western world view Jinn or the genie as being rather harmless. Kind of fun characters. The Robin Williams blue genie from the cartoon Aladdin, which was wonderfully reprised by Will Smith in the live-action version of that movie. By the way, if you have never seen the live-action Aladdin with Will Smith as the genie, I highly recommend it. You come out of that thinking what a joyful experience that was. And it really is. And but this is the way we've watered down the Jinn. Jinn are harmless, bumbling at times, easy to control and manipulate. But in actuality, when you start looking at who the Jinn were, this is the farthest thing from the truth about these beings. The people of the Middle East, in both ancient and modern times, considered the Jinn to be very dangerous beings, and they were uncontrollable. The Quran states that, like a human being, jinns have free will, and they can choose between good and evil. Now, this means that not all jinn are evil, some are good, and many are simply indifferent and don't want to be bothered by humans. The Quran has an entire surah that's dedicated to the jinn called Al-Jinn. And it's probably interesting reading if you have time to look that up. Jinn don't have physical form, but they can take on a number of different shapes. In the Arab country of Oman, residents in the village near Hajar Mountains believe a jinn can enter our world for an undetermined period of time. The Hajar Mountains in northeastern Oman are the highest mountain range in the eastern Arabic Peninsula, and it's deep in these mountains that Arabs believe is one of the places in which the jinn can enter our world. And to go unnoticed, jinn like to take the shapes of humans or animals. And the mountain people of Oman believe you can tell a jinn, or a genie, from human by looking into their eyes. Since they can mimic the human body, they have difficulty with the eyes. The eyes of a jinn would be yellow, with elongated pupils. Since they have this difficulty and don't want to be discovered, most of them will take the shape of a snake or a dog or some other animal that's common in the area. Now, when you think about this, too, there is folklore, if you will, or I don't want to call it theory, but descriptions of the demonic from, say, Roman Catholic descriptions of the demonic and other descriptions of the demonic, that they can take human form. These demons can, but there's always something missing. There's like a missing limb, or the eyes are blacked out, or hollow shells and things like that. And so this corresponds with the genie a bit, that there's always some missing element when they take human form. That reminds me of, there was a dream, and I may have talked about this whole dream experience, when we had a fire in our ranch house back, about 12 years ago. And I had the dreams, and I talked about seeing the little girls that were dressed in like burlappy and with rope belts and scraggly hair and so on. Well, my daughters said they had dreams that same night, and they told me about those dreams. My one daughter dreamed that she went up the stairs to the bedrooms, and in front of my son Sam's door was an elegant-looking man. She placed him kind of Edwardian age, wearing the tight, light-colored breeches and boots and the long coat, and it was open at the collar, and he had long hair, but he was missing his eyes. He had blacked out holes. where his eyes were. My daughters didn't know much about this. This is back when they were about 16 years old, so 12 years ago. And my daughter was crying, telling me about this dream, that she came up in this demon. Well, he didn't identify himself at that, but this character was standing in front of my son's bedroom door and said, "You can't enter here. This one is mine." Scary enough for a dream. But then when you think of the description of demons, he fit that bill. So, what was that really? So there's male and female jinn, by the way, and they do marry. They do have families. There you go. That's where the race comes in. The family relatives are bonded together in clans that are ruled by a king. The jinn children seem to be very curious about humans. They'll often appear as fairies, gnomes, elves, and other creatures that are prominent in mythology. Now you see where the crossovers take place here. All of the things that we are familiar with in Western culture, gnomes and fairies and ogres and elves and things like that, are all part of this caste of the jinn. The jinn who are really the only thing other than angels, humans, and jinn, according to Islamic mythology. And so although the jinn children are taught by their parents to fear the humans, their curiosity often gets the better of them, and they occasionally will attempt to interact with human children. Perhaps parents should take the stories of their children's imaginary friends more seriously. Did you have any imaginary friends? Did your children have imaginary friends? You might be encountering jinn. And there is also, by the way, when you think of the stories of the fairy folk in Ireland and Celtic Isles, remember there was the fairies could be very benevolent and very nice, very happy. At the same time, they could do things that were very evil. There was the whole issue of the changelings, where they would love a human child so much, they would steal that child and bring it with them to the fairy realms forever. But they would leave a changeling in its place, or they would put a glamour on a stick, and that stick would look like that child who had died in the night, and the parents would bury that child, and then the child would really be alive, living with the fairies in the fairy realm. So a lot of crossovers here in these mythologies. Makes you wonder if they are one and the same. Now, Islamic law forbids humans to marry jinn, but according to legend, it's been done in the past. The offspring of such a union are said to be physical in form. Think of the Nephilim, the Elohim who came down and intermingled with the daughters of men. They have this union in physical form, but are sociopaths that don't know right from wrong. In Iran and Iraq, crazed serial killers are thought to be the result of a union between a jinn and a human. It's also said that the children of this unholy union have great intelligence, enormous amounts of strength, they have charisma and charm, as well as incredible powers of mind control, which come from their jinn half. And the people of Saudi Arabia believe girls who have hairy legs are suspect of having a jinn as one of their parents. Don't tell my wife. If she goes through a period where I don't have to go anywhere, I'm not going to shave my legs for a couple of weeks. And I suppose it's that way with everybody. Everybody's got hairy legs, except me. I don't. I'm not a hairy person. So, on that hairy note, we're going to have to cut out for our break. We're already at the end of the first half of this show. So I want you to sit tight while we go out. A couple of minutes, we'll be back. We'll take it up with the jinn, and we'll take a look at a conversation that someone had with the jinn. Sit tight. Hey folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. Welcome to my show, the second half of it anyway, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can come over and watch the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, or just Scotty Roberts. And you can join the family of Intrepids over there who like to come in and chat in the live chat room. Share your thoughts on tonight's show or anything else. You'll find a good bunch of people over there that I've started to consider as a family of people. A lot of good people. So come on over and join us. All right, we're talking about the Jinn, and I want to jump back into this. Have you ever found a lamp on the beach and or a bottle or something like that, and you just kind of look around over your shoulder and give it a quick 3 rubs, and wondering if a genie will actually pop out of that big blue guy granting you 3 wishes? Well, that's the watered-down story of what the Jinn had become in Western culture. Islamic historical counts of the Queen of Sheba, known to the Arabs as Balkis or Balkis. This Queen of Sheba was the one who was supposed to have married Solomon, the great Solomon, the son of David in the Bible, King Solomon. They say her father was a human and her mother was a Jinn. And although she wasn't in line for the throne of the Jinn, she was able to rise to that position before her 15th birthday. And legend says she had a great power over the minds of others, especially men, and she controlled people to murder for her. Her powers of persuasion were so great that she was able to control the great King Solomon. Some say she did this out of revenge, since Solomon was given mastery over all the Jinn, and he subjected them to slave labor when he built his temple and his cities. And the Queen of Sheba's mother was one of the enslaved Jinn in Solomon's service. Now, what's interesting, if you don't know this, check out with some of your Masonic friends. Some of them might want to talk about this and can talk about it very lightly, because some of these things I know are secret. And I don't claim to know all the secrets, but there is a story that when you think of the movies and the books Lord of the Rings, one ring to rule them all, well, there was supposedly, according to legend, Solomon got hold of the one ring to rule them all. And with this ring, it gave him power over demonic forces, or in Islamic culture, it would have been the Jinn people, and he enslaved them to help build the great temple in Jerusalem. This is not just a little side story that somebody made up along the way. This is one of those deeper, darker legends about King Solomon in the Bible, and that he used these forces to build the first temple. And it's worth looking into, and I could have looked into it for today's show, but it would have sidetracked us from all the rest of what I want to get to. Maybe we'll look into that one of these days. So think about that the next time you look at the Bible or go to church and you hear about King Solomon and his wonderful writings in the book of Ecclesiastes and the Proverbs, and he was the greatest, wisest king. He was also the king that manipulated the demonic, or the Jinn. And he had a ring to do it. So now in Islam, there's no fallen angels. This is because Muslims believe that angels don't have free will. And since they were created by Allah from the purest of light, they cannot be corrupted. And the powerful beings who fell from grace were Jinn. One Jinn named it, and by the way, this kind of follows in Judeo-Christian theology. The angels were the messengers of God, the ones who carried out the tasks that God ordered them to do, and they didn't have the free will that humans had. But at the same time, there was the fallen race of the Elohim, which were not angels at all, just like the Jinn were not angels. The Elohim were the ones that fell to the earth. They're the ones that impregnated the human women. They're and we've talked about the Elohim many times, connected to the legends of the Nephilim. So one Jinn named Iblis, who possessed the power of an angel, refused to bow to man at the command of Allah. As a result, Iblis was cast out of heaven, and the goal of Iblis is still to this day to corrupt other jinn and to destroy the human race. Sounds a lot like Satan, doesn't it? Persian legends say the jinn once lived in this world. They became very powerful. They developed technology that was much greater than what we even have today. The jinn race began warring with each other. They polluted the physical universe. Allah, in an attempt to save the jinn race from destroying themselves, sent an army of angels to remove them from this world and placed most of the jinn in a world parallel to ours, where they could do no harm to themselves or other beings. They sound like the great wars in heaven, the fall of the angels, and so on that came over into Judeo-Christian theology. Very powerful jinn who fell from God's grace along with Iblis were imprisoned in bottles. They were imprisoned in rings, the one ring to rule them all, and the many other rings, the one ring to rule them all that Solomon possessed, and great caves around the planet. And one of these alleged caves is called Majlis al-Jinn. It's located in northeastern Oman. And we could look at that, but there is a book called The Vengeful Jinn, which was written, I don't have the author's name here, but you can look into that. Maybe we'll do that too. So according to the legend, many of the jinn race resent having to give up this world, in which they still consider their home, to humans. They want their home back, and they'll do whatever it takes. And so there's this book I would like us to explore. I don't have it here. It's something you can look at. The Vengeful Jinn, Unveiling the Hidden Agenda of the Genies. Now, Rosemary Ellen Guiley, the now late Rosemary Ellen Guiley, an old friend of mine, after years of research, unmasked the jinn. And they reveal the facts and the legends about this ancient race of beings that have coexisted with the human race for countless centuries. And they contend in their book, Rosemary Ellen said, if you choose to fear one thing in your life, fear the jinn. Because the jinn are, what you might say, the core of all the demonic and evil being stories that exist out there. So humans could be possessed by jinn. Ordinary humans' acts can kill or hurt jinn without people being aware of them, and or even aware that they're doing so. So what then happens? Jinn possesses the offending people in order to take revenge on them. Others who are vulnerable to possession are those who live alone, for jinn are opposed to community, as do the daimones, the pairs of jinn who stay with each person. One whispers good, the other whispers evil. The moods of humans can be affected by the jinn, ranging from happiness to sadness for no apparent reason. And although they're able to affect people's minds and bodies, they have no power over the soul or the heart. So when possessed by a jinn, the person appears to be insane and they exhibit signs of anger, anxiety, depression. A woman's voice will sound like a man's, and a man's voice will sound like a woman's. Physical symptoms include nausea after eating, headaches, frequent desire to fight, heavy shoulders, constant feeling of dissatisfaction, and a desire to commit suicide. So asking the jinn to leave may not be enough to induce the jinn to go, and someone who's trained may need to perform an exorcism to expel the jinn. So demonic possession or jinn possession, those two things are very similar. There's modern experiences of the jinn. They're still prominent in modern superstitions, and encounters with them occur all the time. They are visible in great numbers to those who can actually see them. You could be walking down the street and passing by jinn and never know it unless you have the ability to see them. In the Middle East, beliefs about the jinn are strong in certain areas. Upper middle class people in urban areas tend to look upon the jinn beliefs as superstition. just like here in our culture in the West. When you're in more urban settings and more cosmopolitan thinking, we look down on all these spiritual beliefs that we once upheld. Upper middle class people in urban areas tend to look down upon the Jinn beliefs as superstition, but in rural and remote areas, the Jinn holds sway. Again, it's the things that we cloud our minds with that prevent us from experiencing. There was David Morehouse. He was a retired remote viewer, a clairvoyant for the U.S. military. He relates in his book, Psychic Warrior, how he had temporary visions of Jinn due to a head injury. He was among American troops, camped with Jordanian troops for training exercises in Jordan at Batan el-Ghul, which means belly of the beast. The Jordanians considered it a haunted valley where the demons came out at night to murder people. And it wasn't usual to have your sleep interrupted by the screams and howls of frightened Jordanian soldiers who swore in the light of day that they had seen a demon. Batan el-Ghul was a desolate and jagged valley carved out of the desert that spilled over from Saudi Arabia. There was no life there except arachnids, spiders. And so Morehouse was accidentally shot in the helmet, an injury that left a huge lump on his head. And after this, he experienced the Jinn. And he said this. This was something he wrote. He said, "Sometime in the night, my eyes opened to a surreal light outside the tent. It was like the light of an eclipsed sun, and it wasn't coming from any stove. It filled the night sky. The entire Batan el-Ghul and the hills beyond were bathed in a strange bluish-gray light. I walked to the edge of the bluff and stared into the valley. Dark figures moved effortlessly across its floor. Like apparitions, they poured from the rocks in various heaps and shapes, and they moved about the cluster of tents. I could hear muffled cries from the Jordanian encampment, and momentarily I thought we were being overrun by thieves or Israelis. Panicked, I turned to run for help. Colliding with one of the figures, I reflexively closed my eyes, except I didn't collide. I walked right through it. Turning around, I watched the figure disappear over the edge of the bluff. After that, the lump on my head disappeared." So, I don't know, head injury? Have something to do with that? I've heard more psychics, Western psychics, talk about head injuries or severe illnesses that left them more open to psychic energy and that kind of information that would come. Maybe these things too are linked. Now, as promised, and we've got about maybe we got some good time left here, 13, 14 minutes in this half of the show. And so I want to talk to you about a man's encounter with a Jinn or a Genie in Egypt. And there was a blog that this man wrote, and he posted this in January of 2010. And he revealed that he had recently had an encounter with a Jinn in Egypt. In Arabic, male Jinn are called Genie and females Jinaya, and they're earthbound spirits who may fall into the same category as the fairies of European lore as they live in this world right here at the same time with us, as opposed to the transpersonal forces that reside in the spirit world, which is over there. But they share this realm with us. In the Holy Quran, the great prophet Muhammad himself reveals that the Jinn are real, that they are formed of holy fire or energy, and that they're normally invisible, but they're capable of becoming visible at their pleasure. He proclaims that they're moral, but they can also be mischievous, even troublesome, to those who can't control them. And this is what Muhammad said of them. This particular Jinn was encountered in a shrine at the great mortuary temple of Menidat Habu, where I have been several times. It's in Luxor. It's near the Valley of the Kings, And as a matter of fact, Menadot Habu was where John Ward and I, while going through the entryway into the ancient Holy of Holies of this temple, bumped into none other than John Anthony West coming out. And pith-helmeted and, John Anthony West, the late John Anthony West. And he was leading a tour there, and we bumped into him that day, coming out of the Holy of Holies at Menadot Habu. And so it's interesting, this man's encounter took place there. And he says that after his initial encounter in the temple of December 7th of 2009, he said, I returned to the shrine through my shamanic journey work on December 8th, where the Jinn and I then had a most unusual conversation. He says, and he wants to say in advance that in his dialogue, it didn't occur in English or in Arabic, but rather in nonverbal communication modality. And he conceives of it as think, feeling, in other words, almost channeling. And his job, as always, was to translate and reconstruct the entirety of the contact after the fact from the blocks of the information that he can recall and transcribe into written notes. And as a prelude, he wants to offer that during the second encounter he had with this Jinn, the genie manifested itself first as two disembodied eyeballs. And since this didn't deter him, then it carefully chose to reveal itself as a smoky humanoid form that flickered from the edges, shifting back and forth from one vague shape to another in pastel hues of orange. Now, I've got to tell you here, folks, that remember I talked over the last couple of days about my encounter in the photograph that I got at the stepped pyramid of Dozier. After that vision experience that I had, I have often wondered, since I discovered this guy in the photo, which was only a few months ago, after 7 years, this was the first I had ever seen this character in this photo, the partial figure. I tend to wonder if this may have been Jinn, if this may have been something that I was seeing, because now, like I say, I'm not a rube. I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. I know how to look for things and decipher things, to look for ways to debunk stories, even my own stories, to make sure I'm not just imagining things or making things up or adding details or missing details. And I will tell you, when I took this picture, I took other pictures at the same time. There were no people there. There were no people there that day that John and I were there, other than the Egyptian guardians of the site, which all wear the long-sleeved, long-to-the-ground galabas. And this was a bare-chested, dark figure. I'm going to do this right now just for the sake of doing it. For those of you who have not seen these pictures, I did not do this ahead of time, so I'm doing this on the show. Those of you who are on radio and listening audibly, you're not going to have the benefit of being able to see this picture unless you come back later and check out the archive, or you run quick over to your computer and sign in. But I'm going to go over where I know I have this picture, and I'm going to grab it, a couple of these, and I want to show you, for those of you who have not seen this, I've got the picture right here. Let's see if I can import this quickly enough into my, and this isn't going to be high resolution, so I apologize for that. I'm going to take a couple of screenshots of this and show you what I saw there. Now, after sitting on this particular rock, and I had this little vision, we were on our way walking back through the ruins, and I took these pictures. And I didn't even notice this character. This was 7 years ago, until almost 8 years ago, until just a few months back, I was showing these pictures to a friend. And as I was looking at it, I blew it way up to show the rock way in the background where I had been sitting. And then, of course, what did I see but this character? And so I'm going to right now import this for you. As I'm talking my way through it. I don't think you can see all the dialogue coming up on my screen here, because I got to go browse for it now and grab it. But you should be able to see me once it's imported. You'll be able to see this. And now this picture like I say, this figure evaded me for many years. I didn't see it. And I had taken several pictures of the area, and all within a few moments of each other, and did not see this character. Now, I'm going to call this first one up right now so you can see. Hopefully it's not too low resolution because I'm pulling this from a different place. Here we go. Now, if you look at the screen, I'm going to bring this picture up so you can see it. And it is a little fuzzy, but those of you who are viewing now, you can see this picture. Now, I want you to notice something. This is the Hebsed Court, and over to the far left of this picture is the stepped pyramid. It kind of hovers right over this court. And right here, you'll see, I don't think you can see my mouse pointing at it, but if you look over to the left, there's a white circle. And dead in the center of that, you'll see a dark little blotch. Now, this is what I first noticed when I was looking at this slide. And I took this and I blew it up very large because I thought, what is that over behind that wall? Now, give me a moment here and I'll show you what this looks like when it's blown up. Some of you have seen this before. And so I'm going to bring it in now. I don't know if you can see all my dialogue boxes here as I'm doing this. But this will be the next picture I bring in will be a close-up of this. Now, inside that white circle, this is what I saw. And you can see by the pixelation how big or how much I had to blow this up. But you see here, you can see a shoulder, and you can see an arm going down to the wrist and the hand and the thumb and the fingers and the side of this character. And the first thing I noticed when I first saw this picture was it's somebody who's not wearing a shirt, which is not common in Egypt, not even amongst tourists. And it is very dark-skinned. And you can see this character. And my first thought was, wow, that looks like those old Bigfoot shots where you can never get the whole picture of something mysterious. It's always partially hidden. And so this is what I saw over there. And so I tend to wonder if what I'm seeing in this picture, and there are much better pictures of this, a little higher res. Maybe one of these days I'll get that redone here so we can show those a little better. But that's what I'm talking about. What this fellow's talking about with the manifestation of things. Is this what I saw? Is this what I encountered when I was in Egypt? Is this the character that speaks to me when I'm over there? So these are all big questions to ask. So this fellow, he had this, he said that he knew that the Jinn can be mischievous, and so he tricked it into telling him its name. And after that, he was the one in control, and the Jinn could not lie to him because he knew his name. Remember, the old legends are, if you know the name of a deity or a mysterious spirit being, if you know its name, you can take control over it of some form. And it's like the old Rumpelstiltskin's legends. When they couldn't remember his name, they could not have control over him. And so his name was always secret. This was also, by the way, part of the commandment in the Ten Commandments that says, do not take the name of the Lord God in vain, for whoever knows the private name of God and uses it for vain or vain purposes, self-building purposes, will not be held guiltless. That's how that commandment reads in its vernacular. And so something about the name and knowing the name. And so this comes across in this story of this guy. And so he says that he began by asking the Jinn if there was, let me see here, hold on. I got to find my place in his story. Now I lost my place in it. Oh, he began by asking the Jinn if there was anything it wanted. He thought that was a good beginning. And in the pregnant silence that followed my question, he said, an image of the carved granite altar in front of the shrine came in my mind. In response, the Jinn's field brightened considerably, as though a pulse of energy surged through it in its light, and hesitantly, almost shyly, an answer came, "Honey!" He says, so I digested this request, and my first impression of the Jinn was, before we were somehow like being observed by a cat wanting to be fed, and there was some unwavering, expectant intensity. In response, I used my creative imagination, egotic mental soul, to create a small bowl of honey as a thought form. I held it in my hands for long moments, and he says I was there in shamanic visioning, and he says I had the Jinn's complete attention. And as I slowly extended my dream arms to place the dream bowl of honey on the altar, I said, "I will give you this honey if you will tell me your name." Any resistance in the Jinn was gone, as it took the honey and it drank it gratefully. The Jinn's name appeared in my mind, then satisfied, the Jinn turned its attention fully toward me. Was there an energetic smile? Perhaps. Now, he's going to go into his conversation here, and I'm just going to make one more point here, is that this character that I encountered, that Chris Conway I told you about, psychic medium, said this Egyptian man who said he was attached to me. He would not give me his name at first. He said he needed to know he could trust me before he would give me his name. This spirit being that Chris Conway contacted that said it was attached to me in Egypt. All right, let's move on. Now, the author, we'll call him J, or J is the genie. The author is H.W. The genie said, few can perceive, he says, you humans are creators. We, the Jinn, cannot create, but we can mimic, we can imitate, and we can affect potential outcomes, but we cannot create. He says there was a long, thoughtful pause, and the genie said, few can perceive us anymore, and fewer still bind us to their will. Now that I've told you my great name, he offered respect to me. He says, you can ask me to serve you, and I will. Gosh, I wonder if this is where the three wishes come in. H.W. says, I've been called by other Jinn, El Kabet, the binder. And what qualities and abilities do you possess that might be of service to me? And the Jinn replied, I can protect you from enemies, and I can inflict curses and misfortune on those who oppose you. H.W. said, I'm constrained in my practice from inflicting harm on anyone for any reason. And still he thought the genie might come in handy. The genie says, or with ill will. And H.W. said, how about healing work? The Jinn's field dimmed in intensity, and his answer was startling. The Jinn said, who can say what is written on another person's soul? We cannot purposefully influence their destiny without tampering with their agreement. H.W. said, agreement with who? The Jinn said, with the higher organizing intelligences. H.W. says, are the Jinn below them in spiritual hierarchy? The Jinn says, oh yes. Some of the younger Jinn occasionally misbehave. The Watchers approach them and encourage them in more appropriate forms of expression. Who are the Watchers? Asks H.J. And we got to end on this because I just noticed we're running out of time. And the Jinn said in answer to who are the Watchers, he says, the ones among the higher intelligences responsible for this world. We're not allowed to interfere with humans on their path, although there are some who do, as well as those who function as adversaries. And I gotta stop there. Because HWS are those the ones that the Gnostikai call the Archons, the Gnostics. And the Jinn says, oh, so you know about them, ... And we got to leave off there with the cliffhanger. So much information, folks. We are definitely coming back to this on Monday when we're back. Sorry you got to wait through the weekend for this cliffhanger. We'll pick up this conversation with the Jinn. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend. See you on Sunday for It's Sunday, and then back here again on Monday. Have a good weekend.
Intrepid.